Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On January 23, 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell received her medical degree from Geneva Medical College in upstate New York. She was the first woman to graduate from a medical school in the United States. She was also admitted as a joke. Here's what makes this worth understanding. The faculty at Geneva didn't think women belonged in medicine. When they received Blackwell's application, they couldn't decide what to do with it, so they did what institutions often do when faced with an uncomfortable question. They delegated the decision to the students, assuming the young men would reject her. The students thought the whole thing was hilarious and voted unanimously to let her in, expecting she'd quit within weeks. She didn't quit. She graduated at the top of her class. And in doing so, she didn't just overcome adversity, she exposed how gatekeeping mechanisms work. She revealed what happens when institutions try to preserve their exclusivity through mockery rather than honest opposition. Understanding Blackwell's story isn't just about celebrating her determination. It's about recognizing the patterns of institutional resistance that still operate today. Picture this: November 1847. A 26-year-old woman sits in her boarding house room in Philadelphia, staring at a stack of rejection letters. Elizabeth Blackwell has applied to every medical school within reach. Harvard, Yale, Penn, all refused her. Most didn't bother with a reason. Some said admitting a woman would be improper. Others said it would distract the male students. Blackwell wasn't deterred by propriety. She had spent the previous year teaching school and reading medical texts privately with physicians willing to lend her books. She knew what she wanted, and she understood that no one was going to hand it to her. So she kept applying. She sent applications to smaller schools, rural schools, places that might be desperate enough for tuition money to overlook her gender. One of those applications landed on the desk of the faculty at Geneva Medical College, now Hobart College, in Geneva, New York. The Geneva faculty didn't want to admit her, but they also didn't want to be the ones to say no. Maybe they worried about offending the physician who had written Blackwell's letter of recommendation. Maybe they just didn't want to make a decision. So they did something clever. They made it someone else's problem. They put it to a vote among the students. The entire class would have to agree unanimously, or Blackwell would be rejected. They assumed the students would say no. The students thought it was a prank. One of them later recalled that they believed a rival medical school was trying to make fools of them by submitting a fake female applicant. So they voted yes, unanimously, expecting nothing would come of it. Then Elizabeth Blackwell showed up. Let me build the clock for you, because you have to understand the world Elizabeth Blackwell entered. In 1847, medicine in America was barely a profession. There were no standardized requirements for medical education. Some doctors attended medical school, others apprenticed, still others simply hung out a shingle and started practicing. Medical schools existed primarily to make money. They charged tuition, but offered minimal oversight. Students attended lectures for a few months, maybe witnessed a surgery or two, and graduated. Women were entirely absent from this world. The few women who practiced medicine did so as midwives or herbalists, roles considered acceptable because they dealt with women's problems. The idea of a woman learning anatomy, performing surgery, or treating male patients was not just unusual, it was considered obscene. Medical schools justified excluding women with a variety of arguments. Women's minds were too delicate for the rigors of medical study. Women's bodies were too weak for the physical demands. Women would faint at the sight of blood. Women would be morally corrupted by exposure to anatomy. And perhaps most importantly, the presence of women would distract the men. These arguments weren't unique to medicine. They were the standard toolkit for institutional gatekeeping. You'll hear variations of them in every field that has excluded a group: law, business, engineering, military service. The specifics change, but the structure is the same. This space requires qualities that your group lacks. Your presence will diminish the institution. You don't belong here. What makes Blackwell's story illuminating is how the gatekeeping mechanism broke down. The faculty couldn't agree on whether to admit her, so they delegated. The students treated the decision as a joke, and in the gap between seriousness and mockery, Blackwell walked through the door. Her arrival at Geneva was met with hostility. Townspeople stared at her in the streets. Women crossed to the other side to avoid her. They assumed she was either immoral or insane. No proper woman would want to study medicine. The local paper ran editorials questioning her character. In the classroom, professors initially refused to allow her to attend certain lectures. The professor of anatomy said he couldn't possibly discuss the human body in front of a lady. Blackwell reminded him that she was a medical student, not a visitor. If the material was necessary for her education, she would attend. She did, and gradually something shifted. Her male classmates saw that she was serious. They saw that she studied harder than most of them. They saw that she didn't faint at dissections, and eventually most of them accepted her presence. The turning point came during a particularly difficult anatomy demonstration. The professor was removing the organs from a cadaver when one of the male students fainted. Blackwell stepped forward, assisted with the procedure, and continued taking notes. The professor later admitted that she had more nerve than half the men in the room. By the time she graduated on January 23, 1849, she had won the respect of many of her classmates and professors. The commencement ceremony was standing room only. People came from surrounding counties to see the first woman doctor receive her degree. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Blackwell's degree didn't open doors. It just revealed how many doors remained locked. After graduation, Blackwell traveled to Paris to continue her training. French hospitals wouldn't admit her as a physician. She was forced to enroll as a student midwife. While working at La Maternité Hospital, she contracted an eye infection from a patient, lost sight in one eye, and had to abandon her dream of becoming a surgeon. When she returned to New York City to practice, she couldn't find a position at any hospital or clinic. Landlords refused to rent her space for an office. She finally opened a small practice from her own home. For years, she had few patients, mostly poor women who had nowhere else to go. Think about what this means. Blackwell had proven she could succeed in medical school. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had earned the respect of her professors, and none of it mattered. The gatekeeping mechanisms simply shifted to a different level. If you can't keep someone out of the school, you keep them out of the hospital. If you can't keep them out of the hospital, you keep them out of the medical societies. If they start practicing anyway, you don't refer patients to them. The gate has many locks, and opening one doesn't necessarily open the others. Blackwell understood this. In 1857, she founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, a hospital run by women for women. If existing institutions wouldn't admit women physicians, she would build new institutions. She later helped establish the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary to train other women doctors. By the time of her death in 1910, there were approximately 7,000 women physicians practicing in the United States. Most had graduated from women's medical colleges. Most worked in hospitals and clinics created specifically for women. The mainstream medical establishment had not opened its doors. Women had built parallel institutions and forced their way into the profession anyway. Here's what troubles me about this pattern, and I think it should trouble us still. Institutional gatekeeping is remarkably resilient. When one barrier falls, another rises, and the burden is always on the excluded group to prove they belong, not once, but repeatedly at every level. Blackwell had to prove she could handle medical school. Then she had to prove she could practice medicine. Then she had to prove she could run a hospital. Then she had to prove she could train other doctors. Each level had its own gatekeepers who needed convincing. And the mechanisms of exclusion are rarely as crude as outright prohibition. More often, they operate through what looks like neutral criteria. The problem isn't your gender. It's that you lack the necessary qualifications. It's that you don't have the right experience. It's that you wouldn't be a good fit. It's that admitting you would be disruptive to the existing culture. These arguments sound reasonable in isolation, but when they're applied systematically to exclude a particular group, they reveal themselves as gatekeeping. And when the excluded group finally gains entry, when they prove they do have the qualifications, do have the experience, are a good fit, the criteria shift. Suddenly what matters is something else they lack. We're still living with these patterns. In medicine, women now represent more than half of medical school graduates, a complete reversal from Blackwell's era. But women remain underrepresented in surgical specialties, in hospital leadership, in academic medicine. The gates have moved, but they haven't disappeared. In other fields, the patterns persist even more visibly. Law firms struggle to retain women partners. Corporate boards remain overwhelmingly male. STEM fields continue debating why women are underrepresented. And the explanations still sound familiar. Women choose different career paths. Women prioritize family. Women aren't as aggressive in negotiations. The institution isn't excluding anyone. Individuals are simply making choices. Except when you look closely, you find the same structural barriers Blackwell faced. The lack of mentorship, the subtle signals that you don't belong, the extra scrutiny applied to your work, the assumption that you're less competent until proven otherwise, the culture that rewards behaviors more common in the dominant group. None of these barriers says no women allowed, but they achieve the same result. What Blackwell's story teaches us is that formal access doesn't equal full inclusion. Being allowed through the door doesn't mean you'll be welcome in the room. Earning credentials doesn't guarantee you'll be able to use them. And institutional resistance doesn't announce itself with explicit prohibitions. It operates through 1,000 small frictions that wear down anyone who tries to challenge the existing order. The fact that Geneva students voted to admit Blackwell as a joke is revealing. They didn't take her seriously as a threat to the all-male culture of medicine. They thought she'd quit or fail, and her presence would become a funny story to tell. Remember that time we let a woman into medical school? Mockery is its own form of gatekeeping. It says, "You're not worth the effort of serious opposition. You're amusing, not dangerous. And if you do somehow succeed, we'll treat your success as an exception that proves the rule, not evidence that the rule is wrong." Blackwell refused to be a joke. She refused to be an exception. She insisted on being taken seriously. And when the existing system wouldn't accommodate her, she built alternative systems that eventually forced change in the mainstream. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. How many institutions have you encountered that claim to welcome everyone but somehow remain dominated by a particular type of person? How often have you heard that a field is open to all, but the culture just happens to favor certain behaviors or backgrounds? And when someone from an excluded group finally breaks through, how often is their success treated as proof that the system works, rather than evidence of how hard they had to fight against it? Because that's what Elizabeth Blackwell's admission to Geneva Medical College teaches us. Not just about one woman's determination, but about how institutional gatekeeping adapts when challenged. The gates don't disappear. They multiply, moving to different levels, disguising themselves as neutral standards, operating through culture rather than rules. And the burden remains on the excluded to prove again and again that they belong. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me today. I'm grateful you chose to be here. If you find value in the Daily History Chronicle, I hope you'll subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, a review helps others discover the show. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and let me know what resonates with you. And if you know someone who loves history, please tell them about us. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.